Hello, everyone. Welcome to Lecture 3 on presenting GIS data. This is for Geomatics 310. Hope everybody's enjoying the class so far. We're going to talk through the way we put data into maps today, make it look good, do some stuff with scale bar. I hope you pay attention through the entire lecture because I'll be demonstrating some in ArcGIS today, so you can see some of the different ways to interact with some data. All right, so let's get started here. First, we'll talk about the map design process. Overall, you have an objective that you want to hit. Um, you sort of start the whole ball rolling by selecting your data. Once you have your data selected, and selecting data is essentially finding data that fits your needs or creating data, acquiring data. It's probably sometimes maybe a better way to say it than selecting your data. Usually for me, selecting data tends to mean um, once you have the data loaded in your map, you're refining the data. But for the most part, you can use select data to basically mean acquiring data as well. Arranging the map elements on the page to kind of suit your needs. Then you symbolize things appropriately. We'll talk a little bit more about what that means as we go through this. Then you review what you've created, and then you edit and improve. I will guarantee you, no matter what you do when you first make your map, you will end up editing and improving the map. It's an iterative process. It is not something that is done on the first shot. If you ever have an instance where you have a map completed on the first shot, consider yourself extremely lucky, um, and then go play the lottery that night because odds are it probably never happen to you again. I've never had a map where I've made a map and put it out there in the first shot and it was completely accepted by the person I was making it for. So that's important to remember. Don't get down on yourself if somebody says, "Oh, you need to make this change or make that change." That's part of the course, and you actually will benefit, I think, in the long run by learning about the things that go on. So a lot of times, what we say when we're making maps in the industry is we just try to get something out in front of somebody as quickly as possible. They can comment on it and then give us their ideas because a lot of times people really are reluctant to make comments until they see a first draft. So sometimes put a first draft together in relative, quick manner, and then get it out in front of people and start the comments rolling. But what I would recommend is to follow some of the steps we're talking about in this lecture to get that first draft out there with some of the basics, so you don't get called out for like stuff that's just missing. So let's take that approach. Um, when you're determining the map objective, you want to do this through requirements gathering. A lot of times people kind of make that mistake. When someone asks for a map about something, in order to determine the objective accurately, you want to interview the people who want the map and ask some questions. Some of the things that you normally ask is, what's the purpose of the map? Or is this a map for navigating? A lot of times people will use maps that are hard copy when they're doing orienteering, locating, something here is this is like, okay, where does stuff sit? Um, they use the term compiling in the book for like making utility network maps or construction plans. That happens a lot within the world of design for road design. But a lot of maps are in these last two where you're convincing folks of a particular item that you want to make a point about. You see a lot of that in newspapers or in industry articles. You're trying to show that something is happening. Think a lot about like examples around climate change or sea level rise or precipitation or population, things like that, that you're trying to make a point that there's an increase in population or a rise in heat or anything like that. And then comparing, you'll see this a lot these days with map sliders, where you see a change over time, or you're comparing the same data over different years. So that's a very common occurrence, and I would say any of those reasons for a map is logical. But then additionally, who will be using it? Um, a lot of times there's multiple users, and so you want to make sure that you kind of try to take the most common denominator for a lot of folks to try to hit um, the common themes for the audience who might view it. If you're lucky enough to have a specific expert, that makes putting the map together very easy. If it's more of a generic map for the public, it can be very hard because you have to take in things like we talked about in a previous lecture about ADA compliance. You might be going with a black and white map as opposed to a color map, or if it's for an expert, you kind of luck out. You can make it very targeted with a very few layers, very simple, right to the point. That's often very helpful. Um, the medium is important, whether you're going to be doing on paper or web map. That also determine the elements that end up on the page. A lot of times interactive web maps don't have as much information on the page as like a paper map. Paper maps tend to have all the bells and whistles like scale bars and north arrows and grids and graticules and things like that. So usually paper is the medium where you end up with a little bit more detail and time spent. And that's usually where you need to get your scale bar correct. For the interactive web maps, it's a lot easier because you can drop the control on there and it's automatically linked up with the zoom factor. But paper maps are a little more challenging. And then some of the conditions that are going to be impacting where you put your map. If you put your maps outside, you might need to make them a little brighter. You might make some of the items a little bit more vibrant. You might need to make your text bigger. But if you're going to be putting the map onto a mobile device, then you might want to optimize for viewing and you might want to keep your labeling to a minimum and rely on the people to interact with the map directly through clicking. So a lot of these things go into making a map. So let's talk about selecting the data. It's similar to telling a story. So you have like your main goal and objective, and then you have like your supporting characters. You don't want to make it too crazy. A lot of times you want to keep it as simple as possible so people can not lose focus for some of the fancy data that might be in the background. And you want to make sure that you're not trying to put anything out there that brings anything um, negative to your map in the sense of putting data that may or may not be applicable and be confusing. Or like listed here, you have some privacy concerns, like if you put addresses on maps or names on maps, like things like that tend to not be a good idea when you're putting things on a map. You also want to talk about, filtering data out. And so if you are looking to show maps of a particular type or data of a particular type, you can use the tools within ArcGIS Pro to simplify your data. And a lot of times you do that for working with large scale or small scale data, depending on what kind of details you're going to show. So cartographic generalization, essentially simplification of your maps, is a good thing in a lot of ways to keep folks focused on the topic at hand. So what I'm going to do is show you real quick how you can thin down your layers pretty easy with some queries. So what I'm going to do is hop to ArcGIS Pro here. And what I'm going to do is add in some data that I'm familiar with. So this is North Carolina, and the state transportation improvement program is a large data set that we put out there that has lots of information in it about road features that are going to be constructed. So what you can do is you can use ArcGIS Pro. You can actually search ArcGIS Portal for that layer. And you can use this for any type of data. And I know some of you have already done some of this in the class with using the Living Atlas. That's over here on the right. But right here, next one over is ArcGIS Online. And so if you type in NCDOT STIP, you will get these layers to come back. And so what you can do is you can actually add them in. So what I'll do is look right down here where it says NCDOT current STIP. You can double click that and it'll show you the two layers underneath of it. What I'll do is pull those across into the map and you'll see them pop up. These are web services. And so this is a typical type of map. This data set ends up in people's mobile applications. It's stuff that's in all of our, lot of all of our web applications that are out there. Anytime people want to see like what's being built where with big expenditures. So it's a cool data set. It's fun to play with. But a lot of times people are only interested in one particular type of project in their area. So what I'm going to filter for are these pink projects right here. And those are division bicycle and pedestrian or transition bicycle and pedestrian. A lot of people want to see what projects are specific for that. It comes up regularly. So I'll show you how we filter those out on the line data set here. So what you can do is you can right click on the step line layer and then you can go to properties and you can actually go to something here called definition query. And so what you're going to do is you're going to use the ability to select the data behind the geometry. we've talked about in the past. And we're going to use that information. We're going to thin that layer down to basically remove all this other data here that we're not interested in. So we're going to click New Definition Query, and we're going to say where mode is equal to bicycle and pedestrian. Click right there. We're going to click Apply, and we're going to say OK. And what you'll see is all these other projects that where those line work drops out. And you see right here that you've got the pink ones that we were interested in, and you do have an occasional one down here that's for other types of bicycle and pedestrian. So that's also needed for the map. So, but you can see here that the lines are a little bit thick, and from way out, it's hard to tell what's going on. So that's where we would start to look at choosing the appropriate scale. And so what you can do is down here in the corner, you can use your representative fraction flyout to maybe pick something that makes a little bit more sense to look at those a little closer. Click 1 to 24,000. This is essentially where the data is mapped at anyway in terms of scale. So you can see that makes a little more sense. Even a little tighter would probably be okay. So we could probably drop down to 10,000. And there you go. So that's one way that you can filter the data using a query. That's using the power of the attribute table that's behind the data to see the data that we're interested in seeing all by itself. So just wanted to quickly show you that. That's a cool way of doing things. So what we'll do here is we'll actually remove that definition query by going back to properties, and we can just click little X. That'll make that go away. Say OK, and then the data will come back that we were missing before. And then you can right click and zoom to layer, and it'll take us back out to the state. So that's sort of the way you can go about that type of activity. So back to the lecture. Whoops. We're going to go here. All right. So we talked a little bit about cartographic generalization. Sometimes you just don't need all the details on a map to make it easier to ingest. So you can do things like refining your data, where you remove up here in the left-hand corner some of these little streams in favor of the larger ones. We do this a lot when we're trying to map streams or roads, pulling out those small features that really aren't any use to anyone at the scale you're mapping at and tend to clutter the map. Simplifying features where you take out a lot of the vertices and lines to make it a little bit easier to ingest visually. Aggregating, where you take these small types of polygons that are close together and bring them into a larger polygon to show a larger, so at a small scale map, this is very helpful to know where areas of certain types of features are, like certain stands of trees. They may be mapped at these little individual scales, but so many of them together from a large zoom out, so it's making a small scale map. A lot of times showing them joined is a good thing. Also, collapsing some of that geometry down to squares is helpful. Reclassifying your imagery if you have raster data and you want to remove some of the detail to show things a little bit easier, reclassifying works. But as you do some of these things, you tend to create situations where you might either be exaggerating, typifying, displacing, and that's sort of falsifying data. You should use that as a technique sparingly to make sure that you only do that when it's really for a purpose that's not going to be used for anything dependent upon the type of data that you want to see visually, other than just kind of trying to provide an easy visualization to adjust for your point. Well, just a quick word about map projections. They tend to play a role here as well. We're not going to get into the different types of projections in this lesson, but it's important to know that map projections, when you're working with them, can cause distortions. And you want to take that into account when you're selecting your data and displaying your data. Things that help folks to ingest that a little bit better are adding things like grids so that you can show on the map how things align to each other. They kind of reflect maybe if something's on a sphere. So over here on the left, you can see they've added some lines of latitude and longitude. You have some measure grid if you're in meters, something like you would see in a USGS quad. You also have reference grid. You see these a lot in terms of soil service data, navigational data as well for, I usually think of the old ADC maps, which you may remember that have a reference grid on them where you're like, oh, look, the Walmart's in E5 or something. And you basically have letters across the top and numbers on the side. That's a pretty normal way that finding features occurs. And then for larger scale maps, you can see that these grid lines also help orient users north and south, and then your major meridian lines or parallels, they tend to be called out with darker color. So all different ways to help people understand the map a little bit better. But the thing you'll notice here, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, is that you don't have the lines for the grids running over top when you're trying to talk about features such as the land itself. But if you're really focused on navigation, you might have the grid on top of the features to better assist the user in the use of the map. Some of the things that are helpful is arranging the map elements appropriately and then picking the appropriate map elements for your particular type of activity. Um, think of when you're working with a map, trying to show those main characters and not have the supporting characters cause issues. So, like we were speaking about with the previous map, where the grid lines on the one map are suppressed behind the land area, so they don't take away from what's on the land area. That's a good way of thinking of visual hierarchy. Um, and the question, does the map have a clear pathway? Like, can you get to what you're trying to show easily visually? And a lot of times that will enhance the user experience when you get that layering right. And when you get it right, as you're making a map, it kind of pops right out at you. You're like, oh, that makes a lot more sense to me. And so it takes a little bit of practice, but spending a little time making maps, um, you'll catch on really quickly. Um, Talking about map elements specifically, the things that are on a map, um, these are tools. They're not rules. That's right. You don't need to have all of these things on a map all the time. Um, the things that are most likely, though, to occur on a paper map are the title, the legend, the scale bar, and north arrow. They're the ones that most people will say you don't want to make a map without that. However, um, that would have been more true probably in the 1980s and the 1990s. As we've gotten into the era of visualization using tools like Power BI and Tableau, or even these enterprise dashboards, like these items don't necessarily need to be on the dashboards or on those maps that occur on your mobile phone in order for it to be a legitimate map. And so the world is changing, and that's good. But you still do need to produce a paper map from time to time. And when you do, a good large map, like a map that's like 22 by 34 or 24 by 36 that goes on a wall that you mount, you want to have the map elements present. Even small handouts um, would benefit sometimes by having a scale bar on them at a minimum, along with a title, so that people can measure a little bit. And then also, a title helps you understand what the map is made for. But as you get into things like maybe a legend or a north arrow, a legend is probably the next item in line in terms of my priorities. Like if you have colors or you have patterns on the map, people are going to need to know what those colors and patterns stand for. So a legend is essential at that point. If you're really just showing location, a lot of times location with a scale bar is enough with that title. But there's different calls for each one of them. And some of the other items on here, like a location map, which is sort of like an inset map, which shows you like where in the state you are if you're zoomed in really tightly. That's very helpful. Neat lines are also helpful to kind of keep the map nice and clean and visually, and kind of set you in, make the map kind of pop out. It's good. And then images or graphics are good, especially if you are part of an organization that has a recognizable graphic. Like think of like NCDOT has what they call the triskelion, which is that three-pronged Chinese star looking thing. That's really a neat looking shape. It's pretty identifiable as being a DOT vehicle. So those graphics end up on the page from time to time to show who made the map. So that's kind of what elements you look at regularly as being worthy of being included on a map. Once you get those elements on the page, though, you want to be able to balance them out. So you have to look at the things like the size of the elements, where to place them. Some people place important things right in the center of the page. Some people like to break down the map into thirds. Um, the arrangement of those elements is um, really important to the user who's coming in to see the map for the first time. They want to be able to, not be searching for what the purpose is. And so by placing things where it's easy visually, like how we read, like like it says here on the in the blue there, the eyes tend to be drawn to those areas first and then travel from left to right. And so sort of like how the body operates. Um, if you keep those elements kind of like placed in the right spot, aligned correctly, tends to be an easier map to read. And then you also want to be able to be aware of negative space. Like it's okay to leave areas of your map blank, but you want to be able to have that balanced, and not have all places where there's no space either. You don't want things kind of jammed in there. So it does take a little bit of getting used to. The map on the right side is to me one that is very representative of a map that I've made regularly of the state of North Carolina, or when I was in Maryland. Same type of map where you have like a major centerpiece. Your map is kind of the main portion of the page, but it's divided up nicely, um, with a title and a legend, and then you have a little bit of description about the map, plus the north arrow and scale bar. All very good things, and very well placed. It's a good looking map to the right there. So that uses negative space well. The elements are aligned correctly. It uses that visual center of the page. So definitely a, a good looking map there. Like we were talking about here, when you look at the most balanced map of California, it's not going to be A or B. You're going to be looking at item C because it sort of plays well with a negative space and also shows the state of California placed well within the map page itself. Um, you want to have that kind of feel that's most comfortable when you look at items one. I mean items A and B. Even the where the way the edges of the polygons, the squares, kind of butt up against the state boundaries, sort of make it hard to ingest, and there's not a lot of negative space in between those squares and the edges of the state. Um, it really is something that it is a little bit of an art form, and taking an art class, if you become a professional map maker, would definitely benefit you in terms of learning how to use negative space and align elements correctly, and even just the adjustments of the shapes there. So going from squares to maybe a polygon that looks more like the state of Nevada on that item C, all very wise choices. So yeah, balancing is an important thing to take into consideration when you're putting a map out. But to go back one step, if you are getting a first draft out of your map, um, you may not have to spend as much time working on the balancing as you might want to go for colors and shapes of some of the accompanying polygons around here that maybe serve as background for text, just as a quick mock-up to get what people feel is important down the page. So like I said, you're going to be on an iterative process, and so you may have item C in mind, but you might end up with putting item A or B out there as your first pass, and then you sort of iterate on it from there. So it's all like a giant work in progress until it goes out. And a lot of times, even the map that makes it out the door is not the one that is what I refer to as the final draft. A lot of times, you'll put something out that's maybe 90, 95%, and then the item that ends up going into the publication is probably item, number 100. But what hits the web page may not be the full version. Like I've seen that happen a number of times where we've put content on the web that's not quite baked, but then when it ends up in a publication, if a PDF or something that's going to be printed, that's when you really are nailing down the final details. A little bit of words about symbolization. Um, like we talked about before, putting important elements in the foreground, less important features in the background. Symbolizing the data kind of helps to push some items to the background, even though they might be on the same layer. Helps the items that you're trying to pop out for people to recognize jump right off the page. Using colors and contrasts, outlines, thicknesses of lines, sizes, patterns, all those things are very um, helpful to attract the user, or a lot of times experienced map readers will look for certain text in certain places at certain colors. So if you or you're labeling a river, you're probably going to be labeling the river with blue, either above or below the line. If you're labeling a lake, it'll probably be a dark blue on top of a light blue background. If you're doing the titles, a lot of times the titles are all in caps. If you're labeling a state, the first letter will be in capitalization, and then the rest of the word will be lowercase. So there's a lot of different things that are sort of standard, things that get done. And then a lot of times you play in the mind for patterns. And that's something that is sort of like a nuance of the mind where people will automatically start to categorize and group things. Um, so like we were just talking about these shapes here in A through D. There is, you know, things such as, negative space, like we were talking about putting the panels, your mind kind of tries to split things up, but then there's also you're trying to group things. Like when I look at these two squiggly lines here, I'm thinking of the two dark lines as being something that are more of a category, or like the three triangles here. They sort of go together because they're all dark blue, but yet there's this one purple that kind of stands out. And so down below here in these panels, you can see the things that make your mind kind of gravitate towards the thing you're trying to make pop out. So like you might be trying to locate a particular feature, a particular type, so you make it in pink. But these other blue ones are kind of all felt as though they're in the same category. Here you might have two categories where you have like larger dots that kind of go together, and then you have smaller ones that go together, and your mind will automatically start to group them. Same process here in the third panel as the first panel, where you've got this shape that's kind of popping out. Here you have one, two, three categories like tan, blue, and green. They kind of go together. Then here you're doing that same kind of grouping by shape. And so patterns are something that you can apply and you will apply regularly when you're dealing with lines and points, trying to make people see like things. A lot of times with polygons, you're working with color or patterns inside the polygons. So like if you're trying to make states that are similar show up and group them, you probably use the same color for states or the same pattern that fills them, whether it's squiggly lines or something inside the state boundaries, to help people kind of figure that, oh, these states are showing the same characteristics as these other states. So it's quite, um, I find it quite enjoyable to mess with patterns and see what type of reaction you get from folks when you're displaying the map. That's one of the areas of creativity that I really enjoy when I'm making maps. Um, Once again, we were talking about hierarchy with a lot of layers. You can see here you've got an example from the book where you have big, heavy gradical lines that are over top of the land areas, when really what you want to do is simplify that activity of looking at those states or country boundaries by making the user not work as hard by pushing those to the background. So you can see what's happened in the panel to the right, how those graticule lines have been pushed to the rear. You can see that the water color has been greatly reduced in intensity, which makes the land areas pop out. And then you can see that the color of the land at the bottom has also been reduced in intensity, along with the colors of the countries themselves. They've kind of been reduced as well, um, which also allows them to pop out nicely, but not be offensive to the user as they're looking at a map. And so if a map is pleasant to look at, a lot of times it will allow the user to spend a little more time on it and actually ingest the data a little bit more and um, intently, as opposed to someone kind of looking at this map on the left going, oh my gosh, I can't even understand what that is. I'm not going to bother. Or the one on the right, it's like, oh yeah, look at that. That's a beautiful blue. And those countries, what is actually being trying to be said here? So that's sort of, it's like with artwork. It's the maps are art, and something that's a little bit more impressive to look at or a little more nuanced and beautiful is definitely going to draw the user in, and that's what you want to have happen. Like we were talking about with that cycle, as you get to the end of producing your map after you've selected the data and you've kind of done the mapping and the balancing the elements, you kind of look at the product that you've put out. And this I might be considering a first draft. You can see that you have things that are kind of placed in wacky ways. You have a scale that's maybe not the best type of looking scale. Your legend is huge and it's not really labeled really well. You don't really know exactly what's going on. The map itself has a lot of data that's included in there, and it's hard to pull out what exactly is happening. And then the you know the title here is off center. It's got a needless background shade. You have up here in the left hand corner some piece of the the state of Alaska hanging out there, which is also confusing. It's not very balanced. So I would say there's a lot that can be done to be improved in this map. You might change moving from portrait to landscape. You might make reduce the size of the legend, change the way you do the title, um, maybe remove some of this boxiness around this item here and kind of spread it out a little bit. There's a lot of things you can do. In the next panel, you can kind of see like how that actually translates. So you can see like the legend has become simpler. The household size description here has been included with some very descriptive language, as opposed to over here you just have like the label for what the layer is. The categories are broken out in a nice gradient legend. There's a very large description here down the bottom, which is much easier read than being crammed into a little box. You have the map itself centered as one of the recommendations were for placement, and you have a very nice title and a very readable box at the top. No wasted space. You don't have Alaska hanging out here in the corner. So definitely an improvement over what you've got here on the left side. That kind of takes us to the end of sort of like the presenting GIS data part of the lecture, which is kind of mirrors what was in the book, but it's kind of fun to talk through. But one thing that I wanted to show you that's important, and it'll be important for some of your exercises, and it'll be important for you as you go into the field of GIS or even surveying. If you have to create a map in ArcGIS Pro with a scale bar on it, and you need the scale bar to match um, an engineering scale in terms of inches, that's something that happens a lot. So we'll talk about that a little bit here. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk you through slides, and then I'll actually demonstrate this in real world. But a lot of times, like you've seen when you're starting, you have the map and you have just like some random scale. If you want to create a map that it makes a lot of sense to people, what in the United States, we use imperial units. If you were over in Europe, you would use meters. And what you want to do is you want to create a map that has round numbers to it. You don't want like to have your reference fraction be like 1:1,2,1,7,3,4,3,4,2,2,2. It doesn't make any sense. You want your reference fraction to be round and prefer round numbers. So like 24,000, 100,000, 500,000. Those are excellent choices for rounded numbers. But preferably, you would want to have them be dividable by 12 if you're making a map that's going to have an inch scale across the bottom. So easily divided by 12. So what I'm showing you here is a scale. So if you want your map to be like 1 inch equals 2,000 feet on a map, this is basically what I'm going to run you through here is how to get you to that point. This could be easily, if you wanted to convert to like 1 to 1,000, you would pick like 1 colon 12,000 as your reference fraction. If you were going to do 1 inch equals, what is that? 1,000 feet. It would be like 1 to 12,000, right? Is it? Yeah, I think I'm doing like math in my head, and that's not a good idea. But yeah, so for this one, if you wanted to do like 1 inch equals 2,000 feet, you would essentially divide 24,000 by 12, and that will give you 1 inch equals 2,000 feet because there's 12 inches in a foot, and you're doing that math. So we'll walk you through that here. So what I usually do is I go to the drop down list on the side here, and I pick one of these that is divided by 12, and then set that and see how my map looks. See if the features show up in the right space, the right size, they kind of fit on my page well. If not, I may type something in here. So I might make it 1 to 48,000, or 1 to 12,000 if I wanted to make it a little bit larger scale map. So the way I do that is set it there, and then I start making my layout. So what I'll do is go and insert a layout, and then inside the layout, I will add a map frame. And so I already have one that's rolling at scale because I've picked it already, and I'll pick that. And then I'll add a scale bar. And because we're in America, we use imperial units. I'll pick imperial from the choices I have. We can use it imperial or metric. You can see a little metric here below. And I like the double alternating scale bar just because it's kind of, fun to look at more than anything. And then I'll insert that down here at the bottom. And what you can see is that it comes in defaulting to miles, and these divisions aren't set either. They're just kind of randomly inserted based on, some arbitrary ESRI choices. So this isn't what I would consider to be a correct scale. Yeah, you have a scale on the map, scale bar on the map, and you can use, maybe your thumb or whatever is as wide as one of those breaks, but it's really not going to match up nicely with an engineering scale or with a ruler. And so what you want to do is you want to have it match up in that fashion. So the way around that is to actually follow the following way of doing that. So once you've got the scale bar on the page, you can select it. You can tell it's selected because it's got the little handles around it. And then you'll see these dialogues kind of stepping through that. You'll have this show up on a flyout. And I'll walk you through this in a second too. But you'll see here, like the scale bar is here in the first. And you see this is like the first page of the properties of the scale bar. You can see that with the little blue underline. And what you do is you select the map frame that you're making it for. And we're working in feet, and I usually set the label position after the bar. And then I go to the drop down list on the second page of the scale bar setup, which is the bar area. And I click this drop down here and I pick adjust the number of divisions. And then the next thing I do is put in the division value of 2000. So how did I get to choose 2000? Well, if you remember back in a previous lecture and what we were just talking about a second ago, you want your scale bar to reference 1 inch equals a number that's easily ingestible. And we know that because our reference fraction is set to 24,000, we know that if you divide 24,000 by 12, you get 2,000. And so you're dividing your division value there in such a way as to match up with that reference fraction calculation. And so the previous slide we'd seen before, if you get that RF of 12 and 24,000, and if you want to see how far ground distance is expressed as feet and as 1 inch on the map, you can do that division as 12,000. I mean, as 2,000 here by doing that simple math. And you end up with that statement of equivalency of 1 inch equals 2,000 feet. And so if you do that adjustment like I've just showed you, setting it up the way you see here, you can measure that in something like Adobe, and you can prove that 1 inch equals 2,000 feet with that scale bar adjusted appropriately. So that's a trick that I use. I like to show everybody when they're putting scale bars on a map. It's always best to have a round number and to have the division value matching 1 inch on a scale bar, because it makes people's lives so much easier when you're looking at big maps or you're looking at engineering drawings or things like that. So that's what I would consider to be a very valuable lesson. So that takes us to the end of the lecture. I just want to show you that in reality real quick, how that actually works. So let's say we wanted to make a map of an area around, let's say where I work. What we can do is we can zoom to that. And then once we zoom in there, we'll make a map real quick with that scale bar on the page. So the first thing we can do is locate an area. So you can use the locate button here to pop up the locate flyout. And you can actually search for addresses. You can do that because ArcGIS Pro by default uses the ArcGIS World Geocoding Service, also the World Geocoding Service in North Carolina extent. So it's sort of like optimized for North Carolina based on your area. If you were somewhere else in the United States and you'd zoomed in, this will change. And there's also an XY provider, which I really don't know what that is because I haven't looked at it too much. I imagine, there's something there that I can learn about at a later time, but I don't usually use that XY provider very much. But you can put it in there and it'll zoom you to where you need to go. Like if you put in there like 2 state plane coordinates, you can do that. But let's just keep it simple and we'll zoom into where I work, which is 4101 Capitol Boulevard in Raleigh. You can see that's popped up here. If I click there, it'll zoom me. And this is the New Hope Center where I work. And you can see right now that I'm sitting at 188 at 1:887 is my reference fraction. And, that's great. That's information I've got. Um, but that's not round. And I might want to show projects that are around me, which is really the goal of my map. My whole purpose is to show some projects that are around me and that are close to where I work. And right now we're zoomed in so tight we can't really find those. So we might want to do a zoom out. So I could scroll out a little bit and I could say, okay, are there any projects around me yet? Not yet, not yet. We don't see anything. Oh, there's one here, this little green dot. There's a project over here for a railroad project. Oh, here's a couple more. And you can see that as I'm zooming out, you can see that my reference fraction is changing. And so right now, that's not round. It's not a round number. So we won't really like that. So if I was thinking of things that are divisible by 12 and give me a nice round number, 1 to 12,000 was a little bit too close. If I type in there 12,000, you can say type that at the bottom. In this thing, we only see one, maybe two little projects here that are visible. So if we use the 24,000, which is sort of like the next major division value by 12, that does capture a few projects which are in the low grade. That's probably pretty good. If I was to do 48,000, we might be a little bit too far out. 36,000 might not be too bad. So basically, this is kind of like how I work with a map. I'm trying to get like rough numbers to try to put that on a page. But I like 36,000 a lot. That gets me a good sense of where I'm at. So I've got Route 1 split at 401. I've got the 540 out here, and I've got the 440 on the inside. So I think that's a good what I would consider a good explanation of the projects that are in my area. So what I'll do is I'll clear out my search by just clicking the X so that little A goes away. And what I'll do now is go ahead and make a map at 36,000, which is 1 inch equals 3,000 feet if we were going to put a scale bar on a map. So the way you do that in ARC is you would go in and you would say, I want to insert a layout into my map project. So you would go over here and say new layout, click this. I'm going to make this on a landscape 8.5 by 11. So I click that, creates my new layout. There it is sitting there, but there's nothing on my layout. So next thing I need to do is insert a map frame. So I can click up here, a map frame, and I can pick the map that I've got over here. The only map I've got, I can click 36,000. Then it lets me draw it on the page. So I just draw a square, let that drop on. There's my map. It's looking great. Um, Nothing too exciting. You can hop up here to see the map frame by clicking on the map frame box here, and that lets you do some formatting, things of that nature. It does, a little bit of adjustment, but it's not really, you know, letting you do all the things. So if you need to move back to the map itself and play with it a little bit more, you can always click the activate button here, and that'll drop out and let you go back to the map view itself. You can click also the map tab, which will take you back. So there's different options to hop around. But where we're at here, we're going to go back to the layout. We're going to close the activation on that so we can hop back and get all the ability, because right now we're looking at the map itself and we're playing with that inside of a layout. So we can move that stuff around in there if we wanted, because we're working with a map that's activated. If you close the activation, you don't get the ability to pan around now. If you start messing with it like you just did, you'll start moving the map elements around the page. So there's a difference. So if you want to interact with the map and move the focus of the map around, you have to click the little activate button. If you don't have that clicked, then you won't be able to do that. So let's say we wanted to insert a scale bar down here. What you would do is you would go up here to insert and you would click scale bar. You can click the drop down here. And you'll see there's imperial and metric. You could click double alternating because that's what I like. It doesn't have to be that one though. And so then it's giving you the crosshairs that have changed color, and you can now draw onto the page where it shows up. So you can see that it defaults in at miles, and it's an arbitrary break for what it thinks might be the best. It is accurate to what's happening in the map because it's tied to that, but it's really not useful if we're going to try to tie that to an engineering scale using inches and feet. So what we want to do is we want to change that. So if we click on it, like we've done before, if you don't see the flyout come out over here, you can double click it, and then you'll see the format scale bar um, flyout show up. So here, what we're going to do is we're going to start with just looking at the controls, and we're going to change the map units to feet and feet away from miles. So now you see the adjustment has occurred down here. We're going to change the label's position. Oh, it's already set to after the bar. You could put it above center or something like that, and you'll see that this starts to adjust. Some of these are, just as good as any other ones. Let's just pick above center for that one. That's kind of nice. Um, the label position um, is something that I mess with quite a lot. Um, next thing you can do is click the second properties option. And right now you can choose adjust division value or adjust the number of divisions, or you can adjust divisions and division values. So there's a lot of control you have here. I tend to just adjust the number of divisions just to get it easy. So I click that, and you can see that ARC is choosing something that it thinks is logical, but it's not quite right. So we're going to flip that to 3000, and this will set it correctly because we know we have an RF of 1 to 36,000. Dividing that by 12 gives us a division value of 3000, which should yield a space here of 1 inch equals 3000 feet. And that's really it. At that point, you're pretty much in the clear. You can change additional stuff here about your scale bar by changing the marks for the bar. So like you could flip, you know, any different type of things if you wanted to around. So it's, it's kind of cool. The control that you have over the scale bar, I actually really like that. That's that. You can also change the title if you wanted. But yeah, like I said, all that's kind of up to you and what you think is the things you want to play with. But the most important thing, once again, is adjusting that number of divisions and the division value and having this division value match up with your representative fraction. So that if you do your divisions for units, that they do provide you a nice round number that coordinates with an inch on a measuring scale. Up here you have your additional items you can add if you want, north arrows, things like that. A lot of times I'll put north arrows just up in the corner of the map. You can change your style. You can do all kinds of nice fun things with north arrows. Um, it can be linked to true north. It can be linked to magnetic north. There's all kinds of fun things you can do with north arrows too. You can change the type. You can do all kinds of awesome things. Um, and then you also have like your legend and your tables that you can stick in there. So a lot of control in the layout. You can have multiple layouts in a map, and you can put them on in here. You can link, like they were talking about, having a indicator map for like where in the state of North Carolina might be. Lots of control, but we don't need to get into all of that. I just wanted to show you the tidbits about the scale bar. So I hope that's useful for you. I hope the lecture proves to be valuable as you kind of step your way through the next exercise. And feel free to drop me a line if you have any questions. And I'm going to try to keep my office hours the same on Fridays. It's been hard to get availability during the week just because the job is really tough right now. So if I can't get you during the week and evenings, I'll be shooting for Fridays between 3 and 5. So hope that helps, and good luck. All right, thanks a lot.